Welcome to the Published Author Podcast, where we help entrepreneurs learn how to write a book and leverage it to grow their business and make an impact. I'm your host, Josh Steimle. Today, our guest is Nanette Miner. Dr. Nanette Miner is the founder of The Training Doctor, a consulting firm focused on organizational leadership. She's also the author of 8 business books, including her most recent one, Future-Proofing Your Organization by Teaching Thinking Skills. Some of her books have been traditionally published, some self-published, and she even started her own publishing company. So she's got a wealth of information to share with us today. And also, she rides a Harley, she plays the drums, and while a college student, she spent a summer as the personal assistant to Ronald McDonald. Nanette, welcome to the show.
I did indeed. Thank you, Josh. I'm happy to be here.
All right, before we jump into talking about your books and your experience publishing them, tell us a little bit about this work you did with Ronald McDonald. I've got to get this story.
It is a unique resume item, isn't it? I was actually working for a local McDonald's in my town and apparently recognized as a, leader of others. And back in the day, a lot of parents would have their kids' birthday parties at McDonald's. And I worked for a franchisee, actually, and they operated in 3 states in the Northeast. And they went to the extreme measure of having their own Ronald, having an RV tour bus, and having a whole stage that folded out of the back of the RV. And so this young college student would drive the RV to the so we traveled around the 3 states. Every weekend we were in a different store in one of the 3 states. We never went together because I was not supposed to know that the young man driving the RV was also Ronald McDonald. So I would be in the store and I'd be getting the kids all excited and everything. And then he would come in and he'd tap me on the shoulder and he'd say, "Ronald is here. He'll be ready in 30 minutes. And I'd say, "Okay." And then he would leave the store. And in 30 minutes, I would usher all the kids out and get them aligned behind the RV, and out he would come, and we would do fun things like get in the Grimace suit and fill it with as many balloons as you can, and other fun things that Ronald would do with the kids. And so basically my job was to help get the kids up on the stage. It was like a magician's assistant, except I was Ronald's assistant. But the funny thing was it was just one guy who would tell me Ronald was here, and then don't come out for 30 minutes. We were never allowed to travel together because apparently that was part of the mystique.
Wow, what an experience. Yeah,
You're the
first person I've met who has this on their resume, like you said.
That's what I'm saying. I don't know anybody else who's done that.
So tell us a little bit about your business, The Training Doctor. What exactly do you do there? Who do you work with?
Okay. I've been in business for 30 years, starting in 2021. So the company, as most companies do, has morphed and pivoted a few times over the years. I started as a stand-up trainer in the classroom. I realized very quickly that there were a lot of good stand-up trainers, but not a lot of people who could design good training. So for the next 20-something years, I solely concentrated on designing curriculum for corporate America. I worked with mostly Fortune 500 companies. So you would think that they would be the best of the best. They had the resources and they had the wherewithal to do the best. And I realized slowly that there's 2 things that corporate America does poorly with training, and I was part of the problem. One is that they train in silos. So if you enter a company as a person in finance and you're lucky enough to get professional development, it will probably only be in finance. And they don't make business people. They make specialists. And the second thing is that they really don't do a good job of leadership training. They wait until people get promoted to leadership and then start applying leadership training, which is asking somebody to change their behavior after 15 or 20 years. So after 20-something years of designing training that fit into those categories, I finally took a step back and said, we have a big problem coming when, 2030, all the boomers are supposed to be leaving the workforce, which has now been greatly accelerated because of the pandemic. I thought there's just not enough up-and-coming leaders who are prepared to step into leadership roles. So about 5 years ago, I just did a complete pivot and said, no more instructional design. I'm going to help companies to get their leaders prepared. And the thing that's very different about leadership development is that it's really not a curriculum. It's not a class. It's an experiential thing. So I'm still doing design work, but it's an entirely different approach. It's not designing for classroom learning. It's not stepped. It's really individualized. But if you want somebody to be a a good leader of others, it's a process that needs to be planned for. And most companies don't do that. So that's what I do now. Mm-hmm.
So you've published 8 books. Was your first book, was it inspired by your business, or what's the story behind why you became an author?
That is the only, this is a story nobody knows. That is the only book that is not inspired by my business. So when I was getting my doctorate, we had a project to do, which was supposed to be done internally at your organization. Well, I didn't have an organization. And somehow I had an instructor who really liked me a lot for some reason and gave me lots of leeway into what my assignment was going to be. Simultaneously, my best friend declared to me that she'd been having an affair with a fellow for 3 years. And she and I talked on the phone every day. We worked out at the gym together every day. And I did not know this for 3 years. So she said to me, I want to write a book and tell other women not to do this. This was the stupidest thing I've ever done. And I'm not a writer. You are. So will you help me? And I said, well, that's nice, but that's your sad little story. Nobody's really going to care about your sad little story. We have to turn this into a research project. And so I was actually allowed to use it as my project for one of my classes in my doctoral program because I turned it into a research project. So that
sounds like a unique research project too.
Very. And my professor was so on board with it. It was wonderful. So from that, I then self-published, because once she helped me do all the research and everything, she stepped away and said, I really don't want to be associated with this. And I said, well, this is an incredible topic. And Josh, I got to tell you, that is still being sold on Amazon. And that was published in 1995.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, it's a classic topic. Sadly, I hate to laugh at that, but that's a classic topic. So I self-published, which was 1995. Amazon wasn't around. There was no ebooks whatsoever.
Self-publishing was an entirely different process back then.
Which is why I had to start the publishing company, because there was no other way to do it. You couldn't get an ISBN number if you didn't have a publishing company. So I had to have inventory, and how people say, oh, I've got 20,000 boxes in my garage. Truly, it was like that. I was doing my own fulfillment. I was going to bookstores and selling on consignment, and it was going like that because it's very interesting. I thought it wouldn't sell at a bookstore because who would want to walk up to the counter with a book that clearly says you've got a problem, but it would sell out. Like I would stock on Saturdays, and the stores would call me on Tuesday and say, okay, the book's gone, bring us some more as soon as you possibly can. Then Amazon came along and changed my life, because then I just had to ship to Amazon once a week, and they handled all my fulfillment, and then the book really took off. And then I finally, I did a couple other topics, which were all now business topics. But once I understood how self-publishing worked, that was much easier to just replicate that process with different topics. And then finally, I shut the publishing business down because it's just not what I do. You can have a side gig for only so long, and then you're like, okay, this is actually taking way more of my time than what I love to do, which is professional development. But because Amazon is now there, I just turned all the books into ebooks, and so now I still collect income every month. I just don't have to do any fulfillment.
Boy, isn't that nice?
Interesting. I mean, technology is amazing. Our lives have changed so much, but what an interesting trajectory over 25 years.
It's funny because we look at the self-publishing process today. Those of us who are first-time authors, we're just getting into it, and we think, oh, this is so complicated. There's so much to do. But look at what you used to have to do. You used to have to actually go get the book printed somewhere and figure out how to do that. Yes. And there was no internet back in 91. So even just finding a printer must have been tricky to find the printer who could actually print a book and do a good enough job on it.
It doesn't mean you're getting the best numbers because you're just working with who's in your local yellow pages, right? You can't go to a printer thousands of miles away because you don't even know that they exist. Yeah, but yeah, I had to get little ISBN stickers. That was a whole different industry company that you had to deal with to get your numbers and your stickers. It was intense.
Yeah. So when you understand a little bit about the history and what it used to be like, you can really be grateful for the improvements that have been made today and how much easier it is. I still get people coming and saying, do I have to buy thousands of copies of my book? And I say, no, that's the great thing about Amazon. You upload it and then they'll just print it whenever somebody orders it. It's print on demand. It's a wonderful thing. Exactly. And your story is a perfect example of that. So
now, my most recent book, I will say I did get printed copies because it is a good calling card. It's a good way to get entree to an executive, which is my market. So I did have probably 150 or 200 printed copies done, but like you said, the rest are just fulfillment from Amazon.
So then I'm curious about the next books then. How did you come about writing all these books? And maybe you don't have to tell us the story behind every single one,
I won't.
but tell us what you want to tell us about the next 7 books that you wrote and why you wrote them and how things evolved as you went from one to another.
Well, so my next book was called 101 Media and Marketing Tips for the Sole Proprietor. And that came about, and I will tell you this story because it's a good model. That came about because people kept saying to me, you are such a good marketer as an independent consultant. Can you help me with my business? Can you help my brother with his photography business? And so people kept calling me, and I would spend hours on the phone giving people ideas for free, which again was not my wheelhouse at all. But when I went to publish that first book, I belonged to a professional association. There was a fellow who had self-published his own book. And I went to him for advice. And he said, go buy Dan Poynter Self-Publishing, whatever his book was called at the time, I forget. And once you've read that, if you still have questions, come back to me. And so I adopted his strategy because that was brilliant. And I thought, instead of having these one-on-one conversations with people, I should just put this all down in a book. And when they call me, I'll say, buy my book. And then if you still have questions, call me afterwards. And nobody ever called. And then one day I was doing something with the book. I don't know if I was editing or what, but I was in the chair of my hairdresser. And he said, oh, hairdressers need this book because they're all artists. They're not business people. And they all go out of business in 3 years. And I said, well, I don't know anything about the salon industry. And he said, I'll help you rewrite it. So I took him to lunch one day. We had a bottle of wine. Every single tip that that was in the original book, we just went through and modified so it has applied to a salon owner. And I had the #1 salon marketing book on Amazon for like 5 years.
Wow, that's great.
Because it was the only one out there. And all I did was model it on the first one. So, like I had said earlier, once I figured out self-publishing, I was able to replicate it. Once I had a model for that next book, then I was able to replicate that. And then my third book, I think, came about because I was teaching a continuing ed class for a local college on how to start a business. So I actually wrote a 7-chapter book on it. And then it forced me to write that book because I would hand it out each week and ask them to proofread it and give it back to me. But then we would talk about all the concepts in that. So it's just based on what's happening in my life right now and what do I feel passionate about, which is why my last book, Future-Proofing Your Organization Through Teaching Thinking Skills, came about because a lot of leadership is critical thinking, and we're not helping people to become more critical thinkers.
So it sounds like you enjoy writing. Is that right?
I love writing. Yeah. If I could do nothing else, I would write.
So was there a point when you realized you're a writer? I mean, was this something that you grew up doing when you were a kid that you loved to write? Or was it something you fell into when you were older and you realized, I'm good at this. I like doing this. How did that come about?
I would say I've always been a writer. Not like I never wrote like short stories or poetry or anything like that as a kid. I just have an affinity for it. But I do remember when I was in college once writing a paper for a new professor who made me bring in all of my books from the library to prove my sources because he didn't think I'd written my own paper. So yeah, that's just a thing. It's a thing I have. My mom was a teacher, so that's probably, ingrained in me from the time I was 4 or something.
My mom was a teacher as well, and she's the one who taught me to love reading. What do you think is the connection between reading and writing?
I think it's probably huge. It's a good point that you bring up because if you're a voracious reader, you have a very expansive mind. You can see possibilities. You can see into the future. You can make connections, which I think a lot of, people who don't read just don't make connections. We were just on vacation a few weeks ago and I was reading a business book and my husband's friend was like, we're on vacation with his friends. And he's like, I'm reading like a mystery novel. I'm like, nope, this is what I do for fun. Business books is what makes me happy.
Yep. Me too. So tell us a bit about your latest book then, because you've learned a lot along the way. You've had a lot of experience as an author. How did that help you with your latest book that you just got out?
Well, it was it was a bigger tome than the previous. I will say, not as a way to pat myself on the back, but I will say that once you write a doctoral dissertation, you can write anything because that's an exercise in torture. So everything after that seems pretty easy. And I do have a personal philosophy which came from the first book, that when people are in pain, they want answers. They don't need to read a bunch of filler. And you did mention in my intro that I have written books with publishers as well, two different books for two different publishers. So when I write for myself and I self-publish for myself, they are smaller books. They're under 100 pages because I just get right to the point. I'm a very succinct writer. It's feedback I have always gotten from professors is like, you don't add enough detail. And I'm like, it's all there. I don't know what you're talking about. I've said everything there is to say. So the last book, Teaching Thinking Skills, was a process that it was a daily process. And I set a goal for when I would have it written by. I did not meet that goal, but just keep moving forward. What I did realize is that I'm a better thinker in the morning. And so it was the first thing I did when I walked into the office every day. I gave myself 2 hours every day. I didn't give myself a word count or a page count. It was just spend 2 hours writing. And if that's one paragraph, that's fine. It's just you put in the time. Because I wanted this to be more of a research-based book than my others, which were kind of just off the top of my head, or our very first book, which was research-based. But I do have a researcher on staff. She's a contractor, but she does all my research for me. And so I would send her, like the chapter outline in advance and say, here's the points that I'm trying to make. Find me the data that backs that up. So for every chapter, I would probably have to read 150 pages myself to get the concepts and then reiterate it in my own voice.
That's great. So this brings up this point of doing research, because some authors feel like, well, I've just got all this knowledge in my head and I can just write it all down and that's going to be great. Where do you see the importance of research fitting in with writing a business book?
Honestly, I think your research is more important for marketing your book, because people want to know that there's credibility in what you've written. And the hardest part is to get somebody to purchase it. So once they've got it, you don't care, right? they made the purchase, but you have to entice them to purchase it. And if you're not a well-known person, not a celebrity, it's too hard of uphill battle to try to convince somebody that even if you are brilliant, that's the most brilliant thing they've ever written. So it's better to have that research that you can fall back on your LinkedIn posts or your ads or whatever that says, 86% of employees say blah, blah, blah. Find out in my book how you can overcome that. And then they're like, oh, I need to have that. So then you can put your wisdom into the book itself. But I think you need that credibility springboard to get people to buy the book in the first place.
Now, when people think about credibility with publishing, they often think about traditional publishers. And you mentioned you've self-published a bunch of books, but you've also worked with traditional publishers. Tell us a bit about your experience going from self-publishing to traditional publishing. And then you were telling me before we started recording that you then went back to self-publishing.
Yes. So my first publisher came to me. It was a referral, but I didn't do a proposal or anything. She came to me, and the reason that she asked me to write for their house was because my first book, the Affair book, was number 3,000 on Amazon out of all the books. And she's like, if you can do that for a self-published book, imagine what you can do for us. Well, the problem with publishers, in my opinion, is they don't really market your book for you. And everything that any author has ever said is true, is that the writing of the book is the easy part. It's the marketing that's the hard part. And for me, the writing is the part that I love, and the marketing is not the part that I love. So I thought, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to have a big name. It was in my field. It was in the training and development field. They're basically the only publisher in that field. It's going to sell itself. And it did not sell itself. And then my second book I wrote for my professional association, who has a publishing arm. And so you think, well, that's a captive audience. They got 40,000 people who belong to this association. They're just going to sell that book like crazy. And again, it was in my field. And they did adopt it actually for a certification that they offered. They did make our book part of that package. I co-authored that one. I have thoughts on co-authoring too. But my disenchantment with publishers, and truly mine are not mainstream. They were both very niche publishers, but huge in the amount of publications they put out in a year and the amount of reach that they have. Is one, they are more concerned with page count than anything else. And I am a succinct writer. So it was very hard for me to meet their requirements of, this has to be a 130 page or 190 page book, because I'm like, but I already said it all. And I know that you've all read books too, where you get, halfway through it and you're like, this is just fluff. Why am I reading this fluff? And I have a real thing against fluff.
And after working with a traditional publisher, you know where that fluff came from, I guess.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing is that they really don't market it. It could just be miscommunication, but the publisher who brings you in and helps you edit is not in the marketing department at all. So they promise you that all these wonderful things are going to happen in terms of marketing, but they don't, in my experience. So if I'm going to put all that effort into making that book sell, then I might as well reap all the rewards for that as well. And I knew that my last book, which I've actually been told by people has an insulting title. And I'm like, that's okay. It gets your attention. Like, are you implying we can't think? I'm like, yes, I am implying that, because people are not critical thinkers. And if you want your business to be successful in the long run, you have to cultivate that in your organization. So my last book has fluff in it, in that I have a whole chapter on activities that you can do that build thinking skills. I have a whole chapter on case studies, but those are all practical implementation. So it did fill pages, but to me, it's also credibility. It's not like I'm saying, hey, you should do this and not telling you how. I'm saying you should do this, and you can use this case study to do it as well. And here's how you set it up, and here's the debrief questions, and here's the outcomes you should expect from this activity. And you can alternate it by change it up by doing something a little bit differently this way. And so it's in my mind, a very how-to book, as well as a inspirational book about how you need to change professional development inside organizations.
Was there any plus side that you experienced working with a traditional author or traditional publisher?
No, I have to say no. They have incredible deadlines, so that to me again makes me go, oh no, I've lost my mojo. And I have the ability to speak freely and create freely. It's better work, in my opinion. And so meeting their deadlines and meeting their page counts it was difficult for me. I will say, even if you're going to self-publish though, you need to hire an editor, because you don't see what you don't see. And I will tell you too, so my first book that went with a major publisher, you could tell that I annoyed the editor that they hired me, because in the beginning, that person would write, well, you say this, but I could interpret it this way, or I can interpret it that way. So you need to be more clear. And I'm like, oh yeah, I can see why you're saying that. And then by like the 10th chapter, he's like, I don't get this. And he would give me no direction.
He'd just say, I don't get this. You need to rewrite this.
I don't know what you're saying. I don't know what you're trying to say here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Have you worked with the same editor throughout your books, or have you switched around for each one? Or what do you look for in a good editor?
My first editor I actually hired when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, because my philosophy was I am not paying tuition to learn the Chicago Manual of Style. So I'm going to hire somebody who already knows that to save me the time and the effort. And that did honestly speed my dissertation up a lot. Everything I don't know if you know how this works, but there's chapters, and you can only submit one chapter, and until that's approved, you can't submit your next chapter. So it's just a lengthy process. And mine always got approved on the first submission, which a lot of my friends who were in the same program with me told me took them much longer. So I know that she edited my first couple of books as well. And then I think I probably just went to friends who I know are literate for the last few books. And then there was that one class that I taught where I just gave my students the book and said, here, edit this for me while you're learning. Yeah.
So you said you've got opinions on co-authors as well. Tell us about your experience working with a co-author, pros and cons.
So I've only co-authored, well, the first book was co-authored with my friend who had the affair, but I did all the writing. She did all the research. So we split duties. The second, the only other time that I co-authored was for the professional association. And we were both experts in our field, and they put us together to co-author a book. And we got along swimmingly through the whole process for the most part. But then we basically hated each other by the end of the process. I am a perfectionist, and I'm very regimented. Like I had said to you, when I decided to write the last book, it was 2 hours every day. I never missed that. I'm a very regimented person. And my co-author was a person who felt like they would write when the mood inspired them. And so we didn't have a good give and take. It was always when she was ready, then I had to jump because now she was participating. And when it came to the end, when the publisher edited it and then gave it back to us for final edits, that became all of my job somehow. I don't remember how, but I just feel like I remember feeling like I did more of the work here, and now I'm splitting the royalties. And when you're working with a publishing house, your royalties are pretty small to begin with. So if you're self-publishing, you're taking all the risk. Like we had said earlier, if you're working with Amazon, there's not that much risk anymore. And if you're working with a publisher, they're taking all the risk, so you have to appreciate them for that. But you would think they would do a better job at marketing since they took such a risk in giving you the platform.
You would think so, but your story is consistent with virtually every other author I've ever talked to. I don't think I've ever talked to an author that said, "Oh, my publisher did a terrific job marketing my book. They just had all these clever ideas." I've never heard that story. It's always, they sent out a press release and that was it.
Right. So apparently marketers within publishing firms and meteorologists are the only two people who can do their jobs consistently poorly and still keep their jobs.
Exactly. So what are some of the things that if you could go back in time to yourself when you were writing that first book or the second book, what's some of the advice that you would give to yourself about, hey, here's how to be a better author. Here's what you should do differently?
I don't know that I would give advice to myself because I'm pretty happy with how mine came about. But advice I would give to others is just be regimented about it. And you've heard other authors say, I made sure I wrote 1,000 words a day. And then it doesn't matter if it's drivel. I just go back and, edit it later. The important part is to get the thoughts in the stream of consciousness. That's not how I work. One thing I do very regularly, more for writing articles than I do for writing books, although for the last one I did this process as well, is I am much more verbose when I'm talking than when I'm writing. For some reason, I become very constricted when I'm writing. So I tend to speak my articles or my chapters first. And now thanks to rev.com, I don't even have to retype them. I used to have to retype them myself. Now you can just send your audio file and an hour later you have it all back. And I find that my writing is much more personable and has a lot more stories in it, which is very attractive to the reader. And prior to adopting that process, I would just sit here and type, and it would be very academic because I tend to be more of an academic bullet point kind of writer, but I don't speak like that. So I'm a better writer if I speak it.
How did your academic experience make you a better writer? I mean, you touched on this already, but tell us a little bit more about that, because the training you get in academia, getting a PhD, is not what most authors have, but I know there's some valuable things that you get out of that.
Honestly, I don't think so. And in fact, when people say to me, I think I'm getting a doctorate, I was like, don't do that. No, I mean, I said to you earlier that I think my mother trained me to be a good writer and a good reader, and those two go hand in hand. So I really never had a problem with the writing. In fact, my doctoral dissertation advisor said to me once, you're the best writer. You're just an excellent writer. And I said to her, at this point in my education, isn't everybody an excellent writer? And she said, no, you'd be surprised. So I will not say that groomed me. The only thing it really made me do more was think in depth, how did we get here? Because what I tend to do is say, so here's the answer, and not give you the thought process or the actual process to arriving at it so that somebody could replicate it. And that's all that a doctoral dissertation is. The point of that is, could somebody take this research and replicate your whole research project? And so therefore you have to be very, very, very detailed. Like if you're doing a survey, you have to say it's a phone survey and there were 15 people and they were called between 7 and 9 p.m. and we had a 73% response rate. Like you have to give all the details, where I would just say, so here's what we learned from our survey. So I did learn to be much more detailed and give more background so that people could follow along better, as opposed to saying, here it is, just take the answer and run with it.
So the last few books that you wrote, was the primary motivation, I'm writing this so that I can grow my business, or were you thinking something else while you were writing it?
The last book definitely was, I'm writing this so I could grow my business. The first 101 Media and Marketing Tips was written so that I could stop the phone from ringing and wasting my time talking to people about industries that didn't have anything to do with me. And that was just fortuitous. That really was just fortuitous. And then the fact that my hairdresser said, let's rewrite it, was fortuitous plus. But the last book was really because my philosophy on how professional development is done in corporate America is counter to how everyone else is. Everyone's currently doing it. And I do believe at some point I'll be vindicated and I'll be right. But for me to verbalize that over and over gets me very excited and it just riles my blood. So I realized after about a year or so, I really need to put this into a written form so that people can appreciate the genius and better. Then we have a better conversation. So it's kind of based on the first 101 Media Marketing Tips book. It's like read the book first, and then we'll have a better conversation if you still need to have that. So it was really used as a sales tool. My last book was to say, here is the new philosophy about professional development in companies, and if you agree with what I say here, let's have a further conversation.
And how has it been received so far? Is it working as a tool for your business? So
as I said, immediately people are like, you're insulting us with this title, how to increase thinking skills. And then I had a meeting with a mentor counselor person, and she said, but really what you're saying is you want people to be better leaders. So why don't you change it to how to increase leadership skills? So basically I now just refer to the book as future-proofing your organization, and I leave off the subtitle about teaching thinking skills altogether. So at least I can capture people's attention. But the folks who have buy in wholeheartedly, because again, it is based in research and how we've just bungled things. Like the beginning of the book starts with an analysis of why people cannot think anymore. And truly, in my opinion, it comes down to fill in the blank bubble tests. Because what we taught kids to do was look for only one right answer, because you can only choose from A, B, C, or D, so that we can put it through that Scamtronic machine and give you, your test score and to determine if you're smart or not. And that's not how the real world operates. There's multiple right answers, and you have to have the thinking ability to critically choose the best. And it may not be the best, but you at least put some thought into it. So that's the part that actually grabs people, because they realize you're right. I mean, that was the education that I had. That's the education that most people had. And only some people who, I think, again, people who are readers and realize, wait a minute, this isn't how everything works. If you have interest in different, if you are able to read in different interest areas, you become a more critical thinker, because you're like, well, maybe this economy thing is not matching up with this finance thing, which is not matching up with this historical thing. You start to see connections, and so that's really what I'm trying to get people to realize, is that it's the education process that has created this learning process, and we have to flip it in corporate America, or we're just going to have a bunch of people who don't have enough critical thinking skills to run business.
So you've got a lot of ideas. You clearly know how to write. I'm assuming that this is probably not the last book you're going to write.
I think it is. Because it's exhausting. It really is. But what's funny is, like, sometimes I just pick up the book and I read it again and go, wow, this is so good. So maybe. But there's more platforms for writing short form now. There's Medium, there's LinkedIn, there's my own blog. So I don't feel like I really need to write a book anymore. Once you've captured the audience, you can keep them engaged by sending out shorter form. And new discoveries all the time. And one of the problems with writing a book for a publisher is you can't go back and edit it. Like, I've already found things with the thinking skills book that next time I'm ready to get more hard copies, I'm going to update some of the things, which you wouldn't be able to do with a traditional publisher, because with a traditional publisher, your book has to be 30% new for it to be a second edition. So that's a lot of edition, where I might just update a chart or some statistics to bring it from 2017 when I wrote it to 2020. So it's another plus for publishing yourself, because you can mold that every year if you want to.
With your self-publishing, do you just go through Amazon KDP, or do you use Ingram Spark, or how are you actually getting the book produced?
Amazon KDP, but honestly, I couldn't tell you much about that because I hired a company to do it for me.
Okay. So we might have to wait a while for your next book for the inspiration to strike, but who knows? And tell us a little bit more about the publishing that you're doing on Medium and other outlets. do you have an audience that you've built up from your books that is following you? How do you stay in touch with the people who like your information? How do you make sure that you can get that out to them? Do you have an email list, or how have you built your tribe?
Yes, and so I would say I'm not using Medium all that extensively. I've probably only put 4 or 5 articles out there, and those tend to be more personal or opinion things. Like I know I wrote one recently that said, my first job taught me so much about this, that, and the other thing. And, I interviewed a few friends who I asked the same question, like, what are you still doing today that you learned in your first job? And it's actually part of my spiel for teaching leadership, is that if you teach it early in someone's career, you don't have to correct behaviors 15, 20 years down the road, because that's the only way they know how to do something, right? Because you taught them that from the get-go. So I write more personal things. Like I wrote an article for Medium that was, I don't want to be a yoga instructor. I do yoga consistently and have been doing it for 20 years. And I was approached by my yogi to be an instructor. And I said, I don't know. That totally do not want to do that. And she was surprised. And the more I thought about it, I thought there's a whole different perspective. Like now I'm responsible for other people and I have to think ahead and I've lost the flow and it's not for me anymore. So I wrote, a whole article on that, which again aligns with what I do. Is like some people want to be leaders and some don't want to be leaders. And that's perfectly fine, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't have the skills. I'm still a better person because I do yoga, even though I don't want to lead yoga, right? So they all still have some kind of association with what I do professionally, but I don't feel like they're a professional example. So those go on Medium. I do write on my blog a long form post once a month, and then I promote it on LinkedIn to get people to come back to the blog. And then the things that are more training and development opinionated, I'll put out on LinkedIn itself. So I actually have like 3 different delivery mediums based on what I want to express.
And do you have an email list where people sign up and can follow you and get updates?
Yes. So I have a couple of freebies on my website, and then we collect their email address. I would say that my actual target market is on LinkedIn more so than my email address, my email list tends to be people who are in the field of training and development, and my LinkedIn followers, I have a company page and I have followers to my company page. Those tend to be more the executives and CEOs that are my target market.
Is there any one form of marketing or getting the word out there about yourself or about your books that has worked better than everything else?
Just being available on Amazon, honestly, because if you use your keywords correctly and people have a need for what you're writing on, then they just find you by default, which they would never do in a bookstore, which they would never do by just getting on the internet and hoping that they found a book. I mean, when people have a need for a book, they know to go to Amazon, which is a blessing.
Perfect. Well, Nanette, thank you so much for being with us here today. Do you have any parting words of wisdom before we wrap things up here?
Just do it. And, as we said earlier, I mean, with Amazon, the risk for you is so low. Just do it, get it out there as a credential, and you can update it as you feel fit. If you think like, oh, that really wasn't my best work, just go and update it, which is just a blessing to have the technology to do that.
Perfect. And where's the best place for people to find you?
LinkedIn, my full name, Nanette Miner, or you can go to trainingdr.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Nanette.
I loved it, Josh. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to spread the word, please give us a 5-star rating review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. And if you're an entrepreneur interested in writing and publishing a nonfiction book to grow your business and make an impact, visit publishedauthor.com for show notes for this podcast and other free resources.